Ladies and gentlemen, should I say good evening? We are starting our breakout session entitled From the Indignados to Occupy Wall Street, New Protest Movements and the Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. My name is Jacek Kucharczyk and I run a think tank in Warsaw called the Institute of Public Affairs, which is one of the program partners of the Wroclaw Global Forum, and I want to start by thanking all our partners, thanking the organizers of the forum for inviting us and having us for the second time as a partner. As some of you may recall, last year we organized and sponsored a panel discussion on Polish presidency in the European Union, and we talked a lot, among other things, about how Poland can contribute to overcoming European crisis. And today we will also talk about the crisis, but in a much more broader perspective. When about half a year ago we had a meeting about the programming meeting of the or conference call really about the forum, I proposed that we discuss the big issue. What I see as a big issue is the crisis of democratic capitalism, crisis of a certain paradigm, and the protest movements which basically demand a fundamental change to the way both capitalism and democracy are working, or sometimes not working, in the area which we came to consider as established democracies. At least here in Central Europe, for 20 years we've been working to join the democratic world. The market economy, capitalism and democracy were the keywords of our transition. And by the time we made it there, it seems that the basic tenets of this paradigm to which we aspire are being strongly questioned. Those of you who heard President Wałęsa's opening remarks this morning will notice that basically, as a key problem of our time, we defined what the topic of our discussion. That is, Wałęsa said in not many words that capitalism as we know it is in crisis. And it's in crisis because capitalist competition creates too few winners and too many people who are maybe not losers, but at least they don't feel stakeholders, which to me sounds like endorsing the slogan of Occupy Wall Street movement. We are the 99% who don't benefit from the capitalist system. He also spoke about crisis of democracy, the fact that citizens demand more accountability, more participation, and they have, or they think they have tools to achieve this system, but the politicians are not willing to change. And that again sounds like the Spanish Indignados and many other protest movements across Europe, who also believe that there is something fundamentally flawed with democracy as we know it. So we have three distinguished speakers on this panel, to whom I want to address basically questions around the issues which President Wałęsa raised today: the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of democracy, the response from the citizens, and the meaning of these protest movements, because we hear different stories, different narratives about these protest movements, what they are about. There are some who claim that this extraordinary movement is something which can be compared to 1968, only that in 68 the crying slogan was freedom, now it's equality. So that seems that this is something really substantive and profound going on, not only with the crisis, but with these responses to the crisis. Then there are critics who say that basically the protests in Europe are defense of unsustainable status quo. They are people longing for old good times with welfare state which went bankrupt, so that there is no new quality really in these movements. And critics of Occupy Wall Street claim that this is radicalism, this is new class warfare, and so on and so forth. So we have very different accounts, and I wanted us to talk about these accounts. But most importantly, I wanted to ask the panelists to tell us how they see what I would call the transformative potential of these movements. Can they really achieve a change in which capitalism works, in which market economy and capitalism works, in which our democracy works? And in what way? Will they start a new political movement? Will they affect the political establishment, the way that political parties make their decisions? What would be the contribution? Will there be any lasting outcomes of all these protest movements? So I will stop here my introduction, and I will first ask the first panelist, Elżbieta Matynia, who is professor of New School for Social Research in New York, director of Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies at the New School, but also professor of Lower Silesia, University of Lower Silesia here in Wrocław, who had a chance to watch Occupy Wall Street really close. So please,
first,
Elżbieta.
I want to thank Jacek very much for inviting me here, because it gave me an opportunity to think about what I live. I live Occupy Wall Street. I work just next door to Union Square, and in a second you will see it. I also wanted to apologize for looking at my notes. I do intend always to go on the tangents. I want to be disciplined, and I know we don't have enough time, so please bear with me. I will try to be at least, well, we'll see. So the Occupy movement, we all know so much about it, but let me just stress a few things which are very, very important in my opinion. Occupy movement is trying very hard to remain horizontal, leaderless, resistant to worn-out ideologies and sectarianism, open and all-inclusive when it comes to issues and membership, but insistent upon nonviolence and reliance on the imaginative power of its supporters. What is perhaps most striking, especially in the world of politics, is the movement's overwhelming humanity and its moral dimension. And though it might seem too ambiguous a feature to focus on, in my opinion, this is where its power is located. And this is what, in the long run, will force changes in our political, social, and to some extent, even economic life. From that point of view, the Occupy movement strikes me as surprisingly analogous in spirit, despite of vast differences, to what people experienced in this part of the world over 30 years ago, in this country, and in this very city. And so it's hard to resist confessing that I feel somewhat vindicated, because although in my performative democracy book on the enactment of democracy by citizens, I mostly focus on the Polish experience, I did argue that that particular dimension of democracy can arise in both non-democratic and democratic context. It can prepare the ground for democratic order to emerge when there was none before, as it did in Poland or in South Africa. But it can also revive the spirit of democratic polity when the system has become weakened by complacency and self-righteousness. And this is the case with Occupy. It represents a kind of political engagement critical for any democracy, in which the key identity of its actors is that of citizens, and in which the good of society at large, and not that of a narrow interest group, is at stake. Such an engagement clearly resists the minimalist view of democracy as an institutional arrangement for competing interest groups with their eye on the people's votes. It identifies and challenges perceived injustices through the constitution of autonomous publics and by seeking alternatives to despair and violence. It conceives of another world, whether dismantling communism in Poland or apartheid in South Africa, whether launching velvet, green and other colored revolutions, or the Arab Spring, and yes, Occupy Wall Street. There is no doubt that what began last September 17 in New York under the imperative Occupy Wall Street and quickly spread to other cities, coalescing around the expedient phrase that Jacek mentioned, we are the 99%, has changed the frame of mind of many Americans, prompting both moral and political upheaval. So what's really happening over there? What brought it up, and what does it mean for our future? First, a personal point about Americans at large. Some of you are Americans here, so I don't have to explain it to you. But it comes from someone still living between two worlds who found it both disarming and moving. I'm talking about the notion of the American dream, a constitutive element of the American narrative, a dream that has actually been achieved by millions. Americans are not at all embarrassed by words which everywhere else are cynically discounted as naive or anti-modern. Words such as dream, I have a dream, happiness, in the pursuit of happiness, or other aspirational ideals ingrained in the Constitution, such as liberty and justice for all. Indeed, Americans have taken this promise seriously, and it has to do with their complete conviction that in America, everyone has the possibility of advancing oneself beyond one's given condition. Everyone is able to achieve success through hard work, and that everyone counts. And money was rarely a part of the equation. A good life, yes. Equality of opportunity, of course. An incredible trust in the belief that hard work will bring rewards so that everybody there feels they are middle class. With such an enticing narrative, it is difficult not to fall in love with these people for whom contempt and cynicism are a foreign country. Or perhaps used to be. Because in the last 3 decades, that America has been slowly chipped away. And what has emerged in its place, it's a grotesque degree of inequality, all the more jarring because of the persistence of trust in the American dream. Many still cannot believe in the shocking findings of a study by the Economic Policy Institute, revealing that the top 1% of Americans possesses a great net worth than entire bottom 90%. As if 90% can be a bottom at all. Perhaps even more graphic is the finding that the 400 wealthiest Americans have a greater combined net worth than the bottom 100 million Americans. Indeed, the problem of unprecedented economic disparity is affecting the political life of the country by diminishing the possibility of participating in the democratic process. Our democracy faced ruin, warned Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, if our national life brings us nothing better than swollen fortunes of the few. And indeed, it is the confluence of money with the institutions of democracy, resulting in what I call the privatization of democracy, although I think that probably other people are also calling it that way, because it's obvious. So privatization of democracy that made the emergence of the 99% so urgent, their message sending shockwaves throughout the country. There is no doubt that the question of inequality raised by Occupy has struck a sympathetic chord in the American psyche and became a major issue in public dialogue in the States, clearly impacting politics on the ground, even if nobody wants to say it out loud. Observations concerning the confluence of economy and politics are nothing new, of course, from Marx to Milton Friedman, father of the neoliberal paradigm, who compellingly argued that the historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relations between political freedom and free market. And indeed, with full faith in the natural competitiveness and efficiency of markets guaranteed by the Chicago School, we have repeated this mantra again and again in recent decades, making the free market, along with free elections and civil society, the benchmark of democratization in various parts of the world. Yes, these are not sufficient conditions for democracy to thrive. An extra dimension is needed, namely a locally conditioned process, conditioned by issues at hand, of either enacting or enhancing democracy by citizens that I call performative democracy. At its core is the constitution of a free public space. Think about those squares, large and small, where people can proclaim their right and discover their own performative capacities, by which I mean their ability to take action based in speech. These are the opposite of violence, as Hannah Arendt points out, because it is to act without argument and without regard for the consequences. Actions like these that took part in the New York Zuccotti Park spread nationwide, and in New York this spring moved to various other locations. They are called pop-up occupation. This you may think it's a pop-up occupation of the Centennial Hall, with the key site being Union Square. And whenever I'm there, and I work right next to Union Square, I can't help but think what took place here in this country and here in this city with the extraordinary imagination of the Solidarity movement, or later with the effective theatricality of the Orange Alternative, the revolution of cute dwarfs, that civil society of young people in orange hats, which was regarded by no one as a serious threat. But it was a sign of the moral bankruptcy of the system. To make sense of the theater of politics, one usually looks at the actors and the goals of their action. When it comes to civil society, often referred to as a third sector in the life of democratic nation state, the actors are private citizens acting on behalf of the public good. When it comes to market economy, so-called second sector, private actors or agents are acting on behalf of the private good. And when it comes to the first sector, that is the democratic state and government, public actors are expected to act on behalf of the public good. I believe that Occupy emerged because it became obvious that the second sector, the market and its key actors, agents, while indeed acting on behalf of their private good, were using their economic power to influence public matters, thus marginalizing those who have at their disposal only their own voices. In other words, the problem began when economic inequality grew so large that it evolved into political inequality. In a situation when one individual can write a check to finance the entire campaign of one candidate, how independent and inclusive will this public official be when elected? This is the unsavory confluence I was referring to that results in the privatization of the democratic state, privatization of the public good, a realm in which public agents who are to work on behalf of the public good are increasingly in the pocket of obscenely wealthy individuals or corporations that want to advance their own agendas. In this case, privatization is not liberating, as it can be in the case of the free market, but exploitative, constraining the state capacity to address pressing issues. In its sheer perversity, but only in that, it reminds me of the privatization of nomenclatura following the collapse of communism here. The increasingly tight association of institutions of the state with the market sector, especially when it comes to electoral campaign funds, but also policy issues such as health reform, climate change, education. The increasingly tight association of institutions with the market sector diminishes democracy, as it diminishes the capacity of civil society to make any difference. The erosion of democracy is indeed most visible at the electoral level, when those elected to the US Congress enjoy the lowest level of support ever, a grotesquely low 13%, and yet seem not to notice it. But Americans began to connect the dots, paying attention to the practices of the lobbyists and corporate scandals. Bernard Harcourt, a friend of mine from the University of Chicago, argues brilliantly that this is not about deregulating, but rather re-regulating the market to the benefit of the largest campaign donors. I would put it is about fixing the market. President Obama, just 5 years ago on the campaign trail, said, "I also think that there is a connection between the freedom of the marketplace and freedom more generally." Several months ago, after the Occupy movement was launched, he seemed to be striking a somewhat different tone. And by this April, he was raising the issue of fairness. He said, can we succeed in a country where a shrinking number of people do exceedingly well, while a growing number struggle to get by? Or are we better off when everybody gets a fair shot? While the close dependence on campaign funds and therefore on corporations and the top 1% renders the government strangely powerless and disables most of its initiatives that would benefit the larger public, health reform, for example. It completely disempowers the majority of citizen actors. Hence, the emergence of the movement activated by its potent motto, "We are 99%." The occupiers say that their ultimate goal is a government accountable to the people, freed from corporate influence. Does that not ring a familiar bell in this part of the world? With their focus on the 99%, they turn against the structural crisis of democracy when a majority of people are pushed outside the system while big business reigns supreme. One Occupy poster in Chicago announced, "I cannot afford a lobbyist. I'm the 99%. There has been a whole crop of signs. I'm not a hippie. I have 3 jobs, but I'm still broke." What's interesting, Occupy Wall Street does not seem to contemplate a choice between the free market and the state-controlled economy. In fact, they seem to be impressively resistant to any ideological temptations, but they see a need for some regulations, as they see various forms of capitalism, including the British or Swedish. With its strategically selected original site in the vicinity of Wall Street, Occupy looks at the bankers and corporations that, despite having been rescued by the taxpayers' bailout, seem to be unwilling to change the way they operate. And this is why the moral political dimension is perhaps the most significant aspect of the movement. While revealing the political exploits of the free market paradigm, Occupy is concentrating on developing a culture of self-organization, on conceiving honest alternative practices that, though still in an embryonic state, show the possibility of bypassing a spoiled system with its unworkable institutions and scandalous way of doing business. Bernard Harcourt calls it political disobedience and voluntary insubordination. I actually see it in more constructive, performative qualities. I was trying to identify some practices developed by Occupy. It starts with the decision-making process, of course, at the General Assembly. And there is 99 groups, working groups, that focus on alternative practices and institutions, from alternative banking and an empowerment and education project called OCU, Occupy University, with a horizontal pedagogy concept and so on, to Occupy Farms and Occupy SEC, Security and Exchange Commission. Among the biggest groups, over 500 members, are OWS Direct Action Operational Group, Vision and Goals Group, Arts and Culture, Nonviolent Communication/Empathy Group, and one I like a lot, the Tea and Herbalist Medicine Group. And there is a major project which deals with the alarming level of student debt, which, as we recently learned, is bigger now than the credit card debt of all American consumers combined. To conclude, although the performative dimension of democracy at its most exuberant is usually a temporary phenomenon, it is a very good predictor of imminent change and its direction. And participants will not forget the experience, a foretaste, perhaps as in the shipyards or in the Tahrir Square. What we know already is that with its eye on publicness, dialogue, and compromise, the performative democracy of Occupy Wall Street is not a realm in which insular groups that exploit fear can feel comfortable. Violence, hate speech, aggressive behavior cannot reside there. Some characterize Occupy as a prefigurative movement preparing for change. I saw a sign at Zuccotti Park which read, "This is a sign." It's a sign, all right, and we need to pay attention to it. The sooner the better.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting insight from very close to the nature and meaning of Occupy Wall Street movement. We now go across the pond to Spain, and we'll ask Jordi Vaquer y Fanés, who is director of Barcelona Center for International Affairs, to share with us his thoughts and observations about mainly Spanish, but not necessarily only just the Spanish situation and the same questions. has it already made an impact? What it means for Spanish democracy, what it means for European or even transatlantic democracy to have this protest in the midst of the crisis, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, indeed, I will not only talk about Spain, because we have been part of a pan-European study on what we call the bubbling up of subterranean politics. In Italy, Hungary, Germany, Spain, and the city of and in London, which we view as a multinational city rather than an English, purely English protest. First of all, I'd like to contextualize this, what is happening in terms of responses to the crisis, because there's at least three large phenomena, and I will only focus on one of the three. So one thing that is going on is the traditional sort of left protest against the cuts, against labor reform, and a lot of things that we knew from before. And this is going on in a very big scale. And I would not want to pack all of these as the new transformative phenomenon, because it really is a form of protest that we knew from before. It is much more intense now because the situation is much more acute. Right? Then there is another thing which is happening, which is the rise of xenophobic populism. And this is basically an electoral phenomenon, but also a social one. And it's also partly related to the crisis. I would say only partly, because basically it's happened in the countries which are less touched by the crisis, with the exception of Greece. So places like Finland, which are really not suffering from the crisis. And also it comes from before. So I would not attribute these to the crisis, although the crisis, again, is creating opportunities, for example, in Greece. And the rise of other non-mainstream parties, not just xenophobic, but many other kinds. We see the traditional left being reconstituted in places like Greece with Syriza, or in France with the Front de Gauche. We see the green parties doing particularly well in some countries, green or left greens or liberal greens, it depends on where you are in Denmark or the Netherlands or Germany. We also see protest parties, which may be single issue, like the Pirates, doing quite well in Germany. Or like the, for example, like purely populist but not xenophobic populist, like the Cinque Stelle movement of Beppe Grillo in Italy, right? So there's all this election response, and then there's a third response, which is basically the new forms of protest, and that's the one I would like to focus on. But I think it is very, very important to remember that it's not only Indignados and new forms of protest that's going on in Europe. There's at least these three big reactions to the crisis, and all of them are very important. And in a way, there's of course a growing convergence between the more traditional forms of protest against the cuts, against austerity, against some sorts of reforms, and the new protests, which started basically as protests against corruption and against the state of democracy. So first thing about these new protests: why are they demonstrating? What are the reasons for these new forms of protest? There is a very strong common element, which is the idea of disappointment and moral outrage. It's not just people defending their rights. There's people that think there is something wrong, morally wrong, with the system. This is what is conveyed by the use of words like indignado, for example. You're outraged, right? A second thing, which is often behind all of these new movements, is the idea that the mainstream politics offers no real alternatives. Sławomir Żakowski from Poland put it nicely, saying that in Central and Eastern Europe, politics has become less and less of a matter of right versus left, and it's more and more right versus wrong. Basically, you can either vote the mainstream parties, which have the formula that works, or you can vote for lunatics, populists, which will ruin the country. The way also Ivan Krastiev puts it is that in the 90s, we all hoped that Bulgaria would become a place like Greece, which with the help of EU funds and conditionality would be more or less a workable place where people would have a better life. And now what we see is that Greece is more like becoming like Bulgaria, which is a place that you can vote whatever you want, you can change governments. Actually, the Bulgarians do change governments all the time, but policies will not change. So yes, you can change the ones in government, but no, you cannot change the policies. And these, which used to be a feature of especially Southeastern Europe, seems to be now the destiny of Southern Europe. And Southern Europe is resisting in these new forms of protest. But some would say not only Southern Europe, some would say Europe as a whole. There's also an idea which is shared to these movements, and Elżbieta has been talking about it, so I will not stop a lot, but the idea is that in the triangle between society, the corporate world, and the state or government, the state and the private world are becoming closer and closer and more intertwined, and the society, the third side of the triangle, feels more and more estranged from the other two. And this feeling that state and business or corporate world are becoming one and is sort of the enemy is, for example, conveyed in the first slogan of the 15 May protests in Spain, the 15 May 2011, the start of the Indignados movement, which say, we are not merchandise at the hands of politicians and bankers. And this idea that politicians and bankers have become almost one thing is strong. And then there's another common feature, which is that the crisis is a symptom of a rotten system, is not the problem. The problem is not the euro crisis, the problem is not the debt crisis. There is something deeper. That's something that is also shared by this protest movement. And also, there is not basically a personal fear that they're suffering a lot. Greece is the exception, but I say in Greece this is more a traditional protest. The new protesters are seldom people who are in a very difficult situation. More often than not, they will define their own personal situation, even in Spain, as good. But what they do have is fear of declassing. People who think their way of life is not sustainable into the future in the current system. Which is not exactly the same as being people who are desperate and go out in the street out of desperation. Actually, it's almost the contrary. So what do they propose? Well, there's a lot of, again, traditional proposals, stop austerity, don't make firing people easier, more social protection. But there's some, I would say, quite innovative proposals. Some of them have to do with democratic renewal, more transparency. In some countries, change of the election law. In some other countries, they're asking for a more widespread use of referendum. In Italy, they have, for example, the protests were not so prominent, but there was an important movement that came together to bring three big issues into national referendums. They managed to get the signatures, get the referendums passed by more than 50% of turnout, and then win the referenda on, I think it was water, nuclear energy, and accountability of ministers for corruption cases. So it's not only protesting, sometimes it's other kinds of action to revitalize democracy. There's a second trend, which is about information, neutral internet. In many countries, the protest is directed against traditional media, saying media are not telling the whole story, media are not helping us understand what's going on. A better control of finance, either it be a financial transaction tax or limits to the executive pay, which is seen as outrageous, as indecent, end to bailouts, all these things. And then there's a number of country-specific demands. In Israel, it's housing rights. In Spain, it's the situation of mortgage holders. In Britain and in Chile, it's university taxes. It depends on the country. Now, how do they protest? What is new in this protest? I think that's interesting because we keep saying it's new, but in what it differs from what we had before. Well, the symbolism of public space occupation, that's very obvious. That comes from Tahrir Square, that comes from Cairo, and it has been replicated in very different ways, but in many places. The idea of swarm intelligence, the use of the web, that between all of us we can find information, make it available, and make it political. In general, the success is not only in new media, also in old media. One of the big successes of the 15 May movement, the so-called Indignados in Spain, is that from day number one, they got the attention of the press in a way that was completely unjustified by their numbers. So they were not many, but they were extremely sexy to the media because they had a new message, they had new ways of protesting, they were new people, they were not the old trade unions that we knew that go out regularly on the streets. And they are very good. They still are very good. They're not very many, but they're good at communicating, not only through through new media, but also in the in the mainstream media. What also is new is that they preach by action. So when they talk about new democracy, they try to enact it in their assemblies, in the way they organize themselves, in the local areas, all of that. And finally, I think what's new also is that they directly target corporations and not only the state. So they are not, in that sense, they are a lot less state-centric than the traditional left. Because they go and protest. Let me give you some examples from my city, from Barcelona. They went, a group of them went and occupied the Barcelona office of Fitch, the rating agency, in solidarity with Greece, the day after they degraded their bonds to don't buy under any conditions, right? Or another example is the fight against evictions. So one of the most effective actions of the Indignados in Spain is every time they know about someone who's about to be evicted from their house, they go and protest there, so that they really out the bank that's doing it. Or now the biggest ongoing action in Barcelona is the so-called Occupy Mordor, which is in front of the largest financial institution in Catalonia, La Caixa. So, you know, this is interesting because they're not only talking about we and the state and you state should control the corporate world, they're also directly confronting the corporate world. I think all of these are new features. And then the last, but very important, and that's why we're talking about this here, is their transnational inspiration. In Spain, for example, you would see Greek flags, you would see Egyptian flags, you would see Icelandic flags in the protests. The three spaces of the big occupied square in Barcelona were called Tahrir, Palestine, and Iceland. Those were the three debating spaces. You know, it went from Egypt and Tunisia, and then Iceland from one side, to Spain and Greece, and then to Israel, to Chile. And often it sort of connected with other issues and other protest movements that were happening already there. And then they were reframed and reshaped according to this global movement. So now you have Le Printemps Québécois in Canada, and even now the current Mexican students, they are more and more transforming their originally were traditional student protests more and more into this new framework. Last issue, have they made a difference, or will they make a difference? They haven't made a big difference, have they? I mean, in Spain, the protests started 1 week before the local elections. They totally captured media attention for that week, the week before the elections, which was a big success. But then it was a landslide for the Popular Party, for the right, which really was not a big success because it was the party which was least likely to enact any of their sort of reivindications. But they have done a couple of things which I think are important. One of them is they have contributed to the change in Europe in the austerity versus growth debate. And of course, Mr. Hollande has made a big contribution by winning in France, and of course, the disaster of the Greek economy, of the Portuguese economy, of the Irish economy speak for themselves, so you didn't need that much convincing, but I do think that they did contribute to the reframing of this discourse. They have repoliticized groups of people who had been estranged from politics, and this has brought new blood into, for example, Spanish politics, and that's a good thing in itself. It is, I think, a revitalization of our democracy that new people are ready to go out, not necessarily protesting, but doing all these variety of actions I have been describing for political purpose. They have changed the relationship between media and political discourse. They have challenged the media on their failure to put all this official political discourse into closer scrutiny. And I think the journalists felt in a way that they were being also challenged, and they have changed a little bit the way they are approaching, for example, the reporting about political measures for the crisis in Europe. They have not had, as I said, massive impact on election politics. In this, for example, in the United States, if you compare the two protest movements, you see the big difference. Occupy is not making a difference in electoral politics. The Tea Party is. So they are much better. The Tea Party, as the xenophobic populists in Europe, they are much more effective and much more power targeted than the others, because they are not seeking power, they are seeking to change the system, which is much harder, obviously. I also think that they have closed the cycle of mobilizations. The old social movements coming from Seattle, as it were, by and large, I think, die now, and they have to rethink themselves after all that has happened. They were not at the center. Despite all their predictions having proven true, they were saying, this system is not working, we're going to disaster. They were right in many aspects, And then they did not make anything of it. When the crisis exploded, all this altermondialism, as they called it in France, was nowhere to be seen. And actually, this new movement took their place. And then, well, they've been obviously successful in incorporating new issues in the agenda, bringing ideas, but also what I believe is that, and this is a very European concern, and they also have succeeded in filling a void that is more and more being occupied by xenophobic populists. And if you don't claim that ground, then it is up for grabs. And it is being grabbed by people like the True Finns or Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen or you name them. So I also think it's important that this space of people who are not happy with the system, but who actually are not xenophobic and are not ready to go behind the banner of anti-immigration and anti-Roma in Eastern Europe, that all of this space should be claimed. And I think that in all those respects, they have made a difference.
Thank you very much. Our third and final speaker, Jacek Żakowski, who is here described as columnist of Polityka weekly, but I would say he's one of the eminent Polish public intellectuals, much more than a journalist, and who has been, I think, particularly critical of, for many, many years before the crisis started, of the kind of liberal consensus in Poland, critical and speaking about many issues that are now becoming much more mainstreamed by movements such as Indignados or Occupy Wall Street. And I wanted to ask you the same question that I asked to other two panelists: what do you make out of those movements, but also a bit maybe with Polish or Central European focus, because there was an attempt to have Polish Indignados protest last year. It wasn't very successful, but literally in recent days we have attempts to create Polish Occupy movements, and so that it's not quite true that Poland, as this famous green island floating on European recession, is completely free from the same concerns that animate the protest movements both in Europe and across the Atlantic. So please.
Thanks. Well, not much left to be added after these two fantastic lectures. What I would say, Poland, of course, is the green island, but the green color is on the expense of the young generation. I mean, it's really something important happened here, that the older generation, my generation, is exploiting its sons, its daughters, and feels very well with this kind of absolutely new situation, because in the entire culture of the civilization was that parents intended to preserve the best future for children. It was clear. It finished. It finished. I mean, some people care about their children in Poland, but not about younger generation. And in Poland, I mean, this is not a very much class conflict. This is not very much a political conflict, but this is intergeneration conflict in terms of economy. It's not about freedom, it's about equality. It's even not so much about money. It's about dignity of the young generation. Because what happened? It happened that we, I mean, you are a bit younger, but baby boomers and the next generation, the X generation, we have good jobs. We are employed on full circumstances. We have some money in banks. We have houses, apartments, cars. They have no chance to have this any time in their life if the system exists. So this is Well, I think this is a difference between Poland and the United States, because in the American Occupy movement there are also people of our generation, baby boomers, but not here. Some of them, yeah. But not in Poland, definitely. This is the first. The second is this is a conflict between very traditionalistic culture of our generation and very liberal-minded. I mean, the entire society is created of self-made people in this country. We had nothing 20 years ago, and if somebody has something, he is self-made man. Nothing was inherited, or almost nothing was inherited. So, and then the next generation comes, and they are totally different in cultural matters. They belong, I mean, at least this better educated part. There are Europeans, there are Poles, of course, but first of all, they're Europeans. If they are Catholics, they go to church like once a month, most of them, or even less. And 40% in the young generation doesn't go to church at all. I mean, this is a revolution in Poland, because in my generation, it's like 90% of people that go to church at least once a month. So, and you have only 60% in the generation of 20 years or so. So we have substantial generation gap. And if you try to turn from economic terms to political terms, what it means. Neoliberal politics exploited several resources, and one of them is demography in Poland. This generation is just a half smaller than my generation. So if democracy works, we will always be able to vote them over. What it means? It means voting about pensions, for example. How big pensions? How much money will they pay for our pensions? They will pay as much as we like in democracy. Well, the other factor is they don't trust democracy. I mean, this is a big difference between the Y generation, the 20 years old people, and us. We generally achieved democracy. This is our generation's success. Well, generally speaking, half of the generation, more than half of the generation is voting. And only like 20 up to 30% of the younger generation is voting. So they have no chance in elections. They will always lose. And they...
But demography works against.
Demography works, and the culture, the political culture. That's why they try to organize their life on side of the society, not within it. They don't enter public life. They try to create super reality. And they created it in the internet. They're living in the internet as a generation, not only as a source of information, but also a social environment. And the only one case when they decided to be politically active was when our generation, the government, tried to influence what they do there. When we tried to put our hands in the internet and say, we will establish new rules for you, they said, no, this is our environment. It's not for you. You are Well, you are not welcome there. This is a children's room. This is not for parents. Well, but if you, and this was against the movement, a very strong movement in Poland against the ACTA. And, well, they achieved a small success. The government withdrew support for ACTA and so on. But in a longer distance, the success against the ACTA created a problem, a backlash. If you look what happened after, it's a growing movement of our generation governing the country against them. Since half a year, you can almost every day something happens. They refuse a new place for Polityka Polityczna and Żakowski you mentioned. They refuse Occupy movement in Warsaw, the right to occupy a small place in the center of the city where they could stay for, not disturbing anybody. We started a policy of refusal to this generation, saying, well, you tried to show what you like and you pressed the government to do what you like. No more, no more. Now we will show you what ruling of the country means. And so I think in Poland this intergeneration tension is much more important than any other, especially because the cultural difference is so big. I don't think in any country this difference is so substantial. Well, if you ask these people, this is a political problem for Poland, and that's why I'm not very optimistic about possibility of progressive change, let's say. If you ask them, do you like the situation in Poland? They say, no, I don't like the traditionalistic culture. And then you ask them, so what you do about that? They say, I'm leaving. 30% of the generation is supposed to leave Poland in the next 10 years. So,
where would they go?
Well,
To Spain.
well, they massively go. I mean, if you are looking for Polish artists, for example, now, you will most probably find him or her in Berlin. In Berlin, living in Berlin. Not because they have a better economic life there, but because they feel better there. So if you say in the US that this is the 99% movement, I would say in Poland this is 20% movement. The small generation movement, the minority, which is losing in the market, on the market, in democracy, and well, even I don't want to be unpolite, but look here. Fox debates problems of sheeps, and they don't even want to join debates about them. They know that the distance is that big, and cultural differences are that big. It doesn't carry any sense. So it's much worse than, and we have sociological data supporting this. So it's even worse than in 60s. I mean, because in 60s they were trying to push the system. Not now. So I don't want it to be too pessimistic, of course. They try to organize some of them, but even for Polityka Polityczna, which is the most influential probably movement of this generation, this is very difficult to gather more than 200 people in Warsaw, for example, or something like that.
Thank you very much for this, but please make sure it's a short comment or question.
My name is Walter Jurasek. I live in Washington, D.C. I observe the Wall Street movement as well. I can only very quickly mention that I used to live in the red capitalist, black capitalist, communist, socialist, and free market economy, which is the best in the world, which is in the United States. Unfortunately, the greed took over. And that is the problem. If we will not fight with that, definitely will not solve the problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to? Please. Over there.
Can I just take on what he was saying? I'm from Chile, so I have a kind of a different perspective of what's going on. But what I've always tried to do is try to look for solutions to the problems. And your descriptive speeches were really good, really insightful, but I think I'm lacking the how do we find the solution. And in this global forum, I think it's good to have the opportunity to see differences between this Indignados movement in each economic unit or state and the difference between what's going on with the global economic dynamics, how this kind of imperialist, capitalist globalization, how countries like Poland can actually escape or catch up with the global north. And in this respect, how would this Indignados movement will change? It would be interesting to see a correlation between these movements in those countries who are catching up or not even catching up, and the difference between those countries like in the United States, which already have a dynamic economy, and those in this Indignados movement perhaps will just disappear very soon because they don't really, perhaps they don't have the same nature as they could have in Greece or Spain or even here.
Thank you. There is one more person just here. Please.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on what was just said, and this is my question to Professor Matynia, because that's precisely the point. The Occupy movement wants to change politics, but it doesn't want to get involved into politics because they're going to lose their purity, you may say. They're going to get dirty. They're going to get their hands dirty if they're going to get involved in the real politics, in the traditional politics. But to get something done, it seems to be inevitable. That's why the Tea Party is more effective, because they simply got involved in Republican politics. That's why they got what they want. To some extent, they got what they wanted. The Occupy doesn't want to do that. How do you comment on that?
Okay, so Elżbieta,
either this is a short-term solution, the Tea Party thing, and I think that
use the mic,
this
please.
is a change of mentality. It's a much more long-term thing. Anyway, I don't have much to say. That's what I would think it is. Yeah.
Annie, would you like to respond to? Just 2 minutes, 1 minute,
Yeah.
whatever.
No, well, very, very shortly, but my impression is that the language of imperialism that was evil and came from the United States and Europe is also completely out of vogue, because the Chinese are not less exploitative of Angola than the Portuguese were. So I think that also these sort of discourses are very much in challenge. And if you see what's happening in Chile and in Mexico, I think it's interesting because a lot of this protest is a lot less about what's happening out there and what they're doing to us, and a lot more asking for responsibility directly to the people. And this is also what happened in Tunisia or in Egypt, by the way. They stopped talking about the United States and Europe, and they started talking about the people who are just above them. And so that was interesting. So I don't completely agree that it's this is the frame in which Indignados would make more sense. The other very short point is just to reinforce your point about not getting involved in politics. One of the most disheartening experiences in post-revolutionary Tunisia, which is an exhilarating place, which I really recommend visiting. It's really exciting what happened there. But one of the bad experiences I had was after sharing a really great discussion 2 weeks after the revolution with 20 years old who had been there in Facebook, out in the streets, doing it and all that. Fantastic narrative. End of the narrative, I say, okay, what are you going to do now? Are you going to join the opposition parties and run in the election? Are you going to campaign for them? Are you going to create your own parties? No. We don't do politics. Politics is a dirty thing, right? So, and this is one of the heavy heritages of all these years of bad politics, which is that politics is seen as a bad thing as such by this younger generation, which desperately needs to become involved in politics if they want to be heard, for the reasons you were actually explaining, because they're fewer than the older generations.
Jacek, Żakowski, your final remarks.
Well, I would say that I'm old enough to understand that things are premature and then they grow up. We had the Polish Revolution in 1980, then some years lost, and then 1989 came and we changed the system. I remember also the famous slogan of Polish, or rather famous dilemma of Polish Catholic opposition, to take part in the government or not to lie. Współrządzić czy nie kłamać. And this is the dilemma of the movement. And I think that at this stage, which is in my opinion absolutely premature, this is very young movement with just raised questions. It's too early to take part in politics, not to lie first. And then when you are ready and when the situation is ready, join the politics when it's different. I mean, imagine what would happen if Lech Wałęsa would become member of Communist Parliament in 1981. Disaster, the end of Wałęsa. Sometimes in politics, like Kutuzov taught us, it's better to wait. And in my opinion, this is this stage. So I'm not very pessimistic. I'm definitely pessimistic. I'm only pessimistic as far as this year is concerned. Nothing will change.
Okay, Elżbieta.
I only want, because I felt that I didn't answer the question, but and I'm not going to answer the question, but here's what I think. I actually think that if you go and sit there with these people, you see how new things are done. It's just that there's such small and minute changes. If you go to General Assembly, you will never want to go to Parliament anymore, because this is where people really have to think very, very hard how not to kill each other and yet to come out with something that will change the situation. I have to say that I am very optimistic, but I do believe that this is a very long-term perspective. When I'm saying long-term, I'm not saying 20 years, but I also don't think it's 1 year, and I think it's sweeping the world. And those new practices that I didn't have time to explain here, like freeganism. Do you know what freeganism is? I mean, you just go there and it's, well, we can live differently. We don't have to go and buy that shit.
Thank you, and I'm terribly sorry that this debate has been cut short, because I think we could go on talking about many of these issues. It's just I wanted to emphasize one point at the end. Elżbieta made the comparison between Occupy Wall Street and Solidarity movement, and today, again, as I said in the beginning, we had Lech Wałęsa basically endorsing the ideas of Occupy Wall Street. So I think this is quite remarkable, and it
maybe why there is one in Poland.
maybe. That reminds me the Leonard Cohen song from early 90s, Democracy is Coming to America. So with this I would like to end. Thank you very much for your participation.